Hi everyone, welcome to this Museums Association virtual conference session, The Superpower of Feminist Leadership with Sharon Heal and Adele Patrick. I'm sorry if you just joined and thought you were in completely the wrong session. I seem to be having some holding slide gremlins today, so apologies for that. My name's Rebecca Atkinson, I'm from the Museums Association and I'll be facilitating today. If you've attended any other sessions so far, then you'll know that we have chat available for you to say hi, to introduce yourselves and to respond to the issues raised. You can also tweet, of course, using the hashtag Museums2020. We have live captioning provided by Stage Text available, so please press the closed captioning option on the menu bar if you want to have real-time subtitles or be able to see the full session transcript. And if you require audio description, then this is also available thanks to Vocalize. Again, on your menu bar, you should see the interpretation option. If you click that and select French, you'll be able to benefit from audio description. That's it from me. I'll hand over to Adele now and see you again at the end. Thank you. You're muted, Adele, still.
Classic error to make an online conference. I'm so sorry. Thanks very much, Rebecca. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here today with everyone. It's a privilege to be here. I did want to acknowledge before we start today so the array of different emotions, fears, concerns, experiences of the delegates at Museums 2020. We've been undergoing something of a tumult in lots of different ways, but I'm confident that the issues that we're going to be discussing are fairly and squarely ones that are relevant to both the wider concerns to do with health, climate, issues of access to culture, employment, intersectionality, inequality are ones that are pertinent to feminism and to hopefully everyone's lives just now. I was so delighted that the introduction today was anchored by this term hope. And I'm really hoping that hope prevails across the week and is amplified by all the things that we're going to be doing together. I've also been thinking a lot about endurance the last wee while, and was mindful last week when I heard Jackie Kay and Angela Davis in conversation about holding these two strong feelings of impatience for change and endurance or patience while we're looking for change, whether it's seismic or incremental in our worlds. So I'm just going to sort of share this screen. So I'm really hoping that we can do that without anything dramatic occurring. Oh, sorry. Can people see this? Sorry, I seem to not be able to do this. I'm so sorry.
Let me know if you want me to share them, Adele.
That's okay. I'll try it one more time. Sorry. Nothing to do with Museums Association, everything to do with me. So I'm just going to try again. No, it's not. Yep. It's not happening.
Adele, I can see your screen. You need to share your PowerPoint.
Okay, I'm going to try one more time. So hold on a second. Is that visible?
No, I don't know why that's not coming up, Adele.
I can see it, but That's very strange. We did trial this. Okay.
Do you want me to do it, Adele?
Shall we do that? I think there might be some little edits, Sharon, but I'll explain them if there are things that I need to explain.
Can you see that? Can everybody see that?
I can see that. Thanks so much, Sharon.
Just give me the prompt, Adele, when you want me to move on.
In fact, we could move on now, Sharon. Let's do it. And apologies for Gremlin. So as we can see here, more encouragement to use the chat room. And we're really mindful that there are very many more people around than might be around if we were sharing a space together. So the chat room is really critical for us to get an idea of what your thoughts are, what your views are, and we really want you to encourage that degree of participation. So just if we go on to the next slide, Sharon. Yeah, just to sort of, Sharon will introduce herself properly in a second, but I just wanted to take a minute just to sort of say who I am, that I'm Adele Patrick. I'm a feminist leader. I'm a co-founder and the creative development manager at Glasgow Women's Library. And for the last wee while, I've been looking at feminist, sort of consciously researching feminist leadership. I should mention that I've been working at Glasgow Women's Library for the last nearly 30 years now. It's our 30th anniversary next year. And I suppose over the period where I've been able to sort of think about leadership this last couple of years as part of the CLAW Leadership Fellowship, there's been an opportunity to really reflect on what's been going on in that particular institution. But also I've had the opportunity to meet other feminist leaders in Kenya, in Italy, across the UK, in the US and in Brazil. And before we go on, I suppose, I wanted to sort of just mention very briefly that I think that this is pretty much an historic moment for the MA and for us gathering today. I was looking back over MA conference content, and I've got a feeling this might be the first time feminist has appeared in the title of a panel. I mean, not that issues to do with gender haven't been discussed regularly, but I wanted us to sort of hold that thought, this idea of maybe this being a watershed moment as we sort of explore this idea of the superpower of feminist leadership. So over and above addressing the sort of intersectional inequalities and things like recruitment and pay in the sector, as in the sort of wider global context, I wanted to sort of propose that we're unequivocally now in need of powerful alternatives to address deep structural inequalities on lots of the registers that the last few conference panels today have mapped. And but really that structural change is a message that was first articulated by feminists in some of the forms that we're discussing today, and abolitionists, feminist abolitionists, from the late 18th century onwards. So these calls for seismic rather than incremental change have now reached paradigm shifting proportions. And what I'm keen to sort of try and open up a little bit today are questions around the sustainability, the relevance of existing sort of leadership in the institutions that we're associated with, in governance and in wider governments and the global geopolitical in geopolitical areas and the management of environmental crises. We've got an hour, so it's a biggie. But as you'll see, Sharon and I have discussed sort of ways that we want to sort of like catalyse something today and then sort of have it blossom out in lots of different ways. So as I've mentioned, I'm joined thankfully by Sharon, who's already sort of gone beyond the call of duty and is sort of womaning the PowerPoint that I'd hoped to be able to sort of manage. But apart from asking Sharon to sort of introduce herself, we'll also be hearing from some other feminist leaders working in Scandinavia, in the US and Kenya, and hopefully from all of you through chats. You can use a QA if you need to, on a wee poll. But Sharon, I wondered if you could sort of like mention why maybe you want to sort of join with me today and work and explore this area, and also sort of mention the slide that you've put up here.
Yeah, absolutely, Adele. And at your service as ever. I can do the PowerPoint. I'm happy to sister up on stuff like that. So thanks, Adele, and thank you for asking me to take part in this session. It's a real pleasure and an honour to be on this virtual platform with you. And I guess in terms of who I am, I'm the director of the Museums Association, but I'm also one of the founders of Space Invaders, which is a women's network in the museum and heritage sector, which I will talk a little bit more about later. But I was really struck, that we are living through very challenging times. In particular, it's been on Twitter today and in the news about the banning of abortion in Poland, which is a real blow to equality and women's rights. So we know that there's still that campaign to be had out there, that we're searching and striving for equality. And I was really struck that we need to, in order to achieve that, we need to go back to our values and back to our feminism. So we were kind of talking about these things between the two of us in various groups and meetings. And then I saw a series of tweets recently by the Women's Organisation, which is an organisation which I hadn't heard of before, which campaigns for equality and provides training and development for to empower women. And they did a series of tweets where they put the question on Twitter: how would you describe yourself? What made you a feminist? And can you say that in 2 words? Which, is a really great, succinct way of kind of digging down into what makes a feminist and what made you a feminist. So I'm going to put that question to you in a minute, Adele, as well as sharing some of the responses. And we do want people in chat to also say, what are the 2 words that describe what made you a feminist? So when I was thinking about what are my 2 words, I'm going to say something potentially controversial now, so watch out. Not the first thing I thought, but I did think when I dug a bit deeper, was maybe those 2 words are Margaret Thatcher. Now, not because she's a feminist icon. To me, she's absolutely not. She's the antithesis of that. But because growing up in Yorkshire, and I know me and you've got a bit of joint background there, during the miners' strike, I just saw the real power of ordinary women to campaign for change, to sustain communities, to sustain families against the odds, and to try and make big societal change. So that was kind of 2 of the words that came up first of all. But then actually, of course, the real answer is my mum, because she taught me and my sister from day one that we were equal and that we should settle for nothing less than equality. So I guess coming down to it was my mum. So Adele, which 2 words would you choose? And you're on mute.
Somebody in the chat room has already bagged mine, so I'm really pleased that I'm chiming with so many people in the chat room. But my 2 words were everyday sexism, and I suppose that's sort of indicative of what I'd say is like a continuum really of a need to address these sorts of multiple arrays. I mean, we're seeing some incredible words coming up here, from life experience to sexual assault, parenting, politics, equal rights, fighting inequality, life experience. And I suppose this gives us, leads us to, on the next slide as well, Sharon, there's a sort of like little illustration of some of the things that have come up in the original thing that you'd spotted. And that and the things that are popping into the chat room are, I suppose, are evocative of what we would say now in terms of the intersecting nature of feminist sort of challenges, really. So so looking at Rachel Thane Gray, my colleague, structural inequality and dickheads in an even more controversial way. But yes, I suppose this is something that we want to tease out today. So I don't know whether on the next slide, Sharon, we can sort of like move on to almost like what we had hoped we might get covered today as well, if that's okay.
Yes, although my next slide has stopped working for some reason.
I can carry on speaking, don't worry, and we can get the slide up in a second. It's really just a bit of oh, that's brilliant, Sharon. So what we really want to sort of activate in this session is to start to generate a bit more discussion on this sort of very loaded, very sort of freighted term, feminist leadership. It's a contested topic. And certainly I think what we've been discovering and what I've been looking at in my research is how hard it is for some of us who are feminists to say and claim this term. So I've been researching feminist leadership in terms of, I suppose, a paradox, that almost like the exemplars of new progressive leadership styles that we're seeing across the sector are drawing very heavily on feminist approaches to group work, to leadership and so on. So for example, this idea of dialogistic leadership, inclusive, reflective, almost like modelling forms of ethics of care. And we've seen this already in some of the sessions earlier on today. And yet feminism is a term that's really barely used. And feminist theory, or this sort of continuum of work that's been happening over, well, say, let's call it the last 40 years or 50 years of second wave feminism, is not really regularly cited. So in Museums Association conference last year, I was really fascinated and delighted to be part of a discussion about how we might address workplace abuse in the Me Too era. But yet again, the discussions seem to focus on absolutely acknowledging and address male abuses of power, but slightly uncoupled from feminist work addressing that issue. And similarly, the increasingly compelling call for the incorporation of different intersectional lived experiences, or this idea that gets more and more cited of emotional labour into this sort of rhetoric and discussion about how we might lead. Sort of it's an incorporation of feminist ways of working, but it's also sort of like eliding it because it's never connected to this history of feminism, for example, the clarion call of the personal being political. So I really want to sort of look at that. And then it's linked to this sort of wider issue of owning, relinquishing and sharing leadership power. And for some, including Black and trans people, I suppose this sort of feminist history has been seen as exclusionary and problematic. And yet feminist leadership, past and present, I'd like to sort of suggest has been for me most vividly modelled by Black and brown women, whether that's Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, the Combahee River Collective, or more recently sort of Sarah Ahmed, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, you know, and certainly lots of women organising in the global south. And we know that feminism has played a crucial role in deconstructing heteronormativity, laying the ground for a queer culture. So one of the things that I'd like us to be exploring is how might feminist forms of leadership centre these exemplary models of feminism. It feels like the openness to change, the heterodoxy of the feminist movement, the continuum of feminism, has been self-critical, it's been contested, it's had flex, it's encompassed sort of plural, even polarized definitions, whilst being anchored to addressing gender inequality. And I suppose this links to the final wee point there that is about the demands that we're making of ourselves just now. If we're going to call ourselves feminists, what is that about? And I know, Sharon, that you're going to talk quite a bit about the Space Invaders project, and I've been really buoyed by seeing, you know, the research that's been done there and how it's clear that sexism abounds still in the sector, that women make up only a third in National Museum Directors Council, that there's this sort of persistent idea that women in leadership roles are taking on a masculinized style of leadership, that women's career progression is still being stymied by caring responsibilities, lack of flexible work. There's loads of evidence of work to be done. And feminism, I think, is the tool to address this. That's possibly less controversial than and less contentious than this sort of question for me of why is it so rare still to find colleagues in the sector who are confident to assert that they're feminist leaders, or are not using, or maybe using feminist leadership approaches in their work, but are not claiming this in a sort of out way. And I think this sort of disavowal, as it were, is evident in some of the clips that I wanted to share by unbelievably talented, brilliant, inspiring, and yet sort of self-effacing feminist leaders, So, and I thought maybe at this point I wanted to pause for a second to hear one of the voices. So I don't know if the next slide is going to work okay, Sharon. I don't know if we're hearing that, Sharon.
Okay, can you not hear that?
I couldn't hear it.
What was, sorry, to go into the tech side, Rebecca, what was the thing that you said we have to do?
Sorry, I'm back. When you click to share screen, you need to click the option at the bottom, share, I think it's share computer audio. Do you want to stop sharing and do it again? There's just two options at the bottom that you just tick.
Okay. Have you got this up to date? Sorry to the audience. Have you got this up to date presentation? Because
I do. It's probably not the right let me just. Yes, I'm sorry. I've just closed it down stupidly. Yes, let me try.
Shall I stop and you do it? Because it probably would be easier if you're doing it anyway.
I'm just going to disappear while I try and find it. Screen. Here we go. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Fabulous. I'm sorry, I need to get to the right bits. Apologies, everyone. Here we go. And I really hope it works. Will you shout if it doesn't?
Hello, my name is Lenore Williams, and I'm the director of the Betty Boyd Dietrich Library and Research Center at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, or NMWA, in Washington, D.C. Frankly, I don't think of myself as someone who practices feminist leadership, not consciously, but I am part of a women-led museum, and most of us who work here consider ourselves feminists. So I'm sorry to say that I've learned a lot about leadership from the negative examples I've endured over the years. As an African American, as a woman, and as an observant human.
Oh, sorry, is that stopped?
Being, I've seen the very ugly underbelly of many so-called forms of leadership. So my leadership style is largely in opposition to those negative examples. Earlier this week, I was listening to a podcast, which was an interview of the musician Diana Krall, and she was talking about the process that she uses in creating and recording music. And at one point, when she was talking about leading her groups, she said, I try not to direct too much. And I realized that captures the spirit I bring to NMWA. She said that she tries to let the musicians she works with do their own thing without too much interference from her, with the exception that she's a stickler for tempo. In my own work, I'm a stickler for tempo in that I believe in laying down the bass note or the foundation. So my demand of myself in this immensely challenging time is to sustain a strong and resonant base note, to create an atmosphere in which the people around me have the room to do the work and do it well, and to take care of themselves in this pandemic, and to be in dialogue and action during this time of resistance to racial oppression.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Sharon, and thank you to Lenora for sharing her perspectives at this critical point before tomorrow's added potential tumult of one sort or another. We thought we'd maybe take a little moment just now to do a poll, because there are lots of people in the room, and we wondered, Rebecca, are you okay to sort of share a poll? And we're asking you to sort of share a little bit of information about your own use of feminist in any professional profile. So there I'm thinking about the way that you might use a term like that in your Twitter handle, or in your job description, or maybe in your LinkedIn profile. Do you routinely use the term leader to describe yourself? Do you use the term feminist leader to describe yourself? And have you benefited from the feminist leadership of others? Now, obviously, this is confidential. We won't be sharing this information anywhere else, but it'd just be really interesting to sort of get an idea from people very swiftly of how you respond to those questions. And we will be sort of picking up on the responses later on. And I noticed in the chat room, somebody's sort of saying, I'm rethinking my online profile as I click on that poll. And yeah, it's really interesting to sort of do that. I've been doing that the last wee while as well. So if people could pop things in, and we will close it. We'll close it in 10, we'll close it now. Great. And we'll get back to you in a little while to sort of see how people have sort of responded there. Now, I wondered, Sharon, whether we could, or if Rebecca's got the PowerPoint now, I've been passing the PowerPoint baton around, but just if we could go to the next slide, which is about defining, I suppose, the need for feminist leadership. So I mentioned very earlier that, and it's the next slide, Ella, that's lovely, thank you ever so much. Yeah, about some research that I'd done the first phase last year. So this is part of a CLOR AHRC post-fellowship leadership piece of research. And please do visit the website, Glasgow Women's Library website, where that's I share lots of my findings and also some sort of reading as well. But I suppose I was thinking that even before COVID, there was evidently unprecedented stresses on the museum sector linked to intersectional inequalities, which I would argue has been a specialism of feminism over this past several decades, around governance audiences, representation in collections. And I suppose also sort of like more recently, thinking about the call from feminist anti-racist groups to abolish institutions that reflect, as it were, the technologies of oppressive power in one way or another, including museums, and that we're now witnessing the mainstream attempt to flex around this. So all the responses to the racism that we're learning about mapped in session 1, but also sort of like addressing both the structural inequalities and specific abuses of power. So thinking about the developments of museums are not neutral, about the Me Too movement, about museum as muck, all these sort of intersecting inequalities being addressed. So we've seen this sort of almost like radical blossoming of independent museums, including GWL, Women's Library, who are addressing in their work elisions, lack of representation, almost like the marginalised histories and communities, lives of women and others. The lack of representation of people of colour, of homeless people, LGBTQI plus people, and forming networks with high levels of engagement and visibility. And also there's a sort of like archival turn and progressive discourses around feminism for artists, creators and critics that we've seen over the last few years as well. But still this reluctance to name and claim a feminist leadership approach. So in this paradigm shifting moment, my feeling is that we might have to refigure, empower and galvanise this intersectional feminist leadership and really name it. So amongst the questions that I'm interested in is how are the organograms, as it were, or structures and ways of working that we can find in some feminist museums and cultural resources, how do they differ or not from the mainstream? How could this learning from the trajectory of feminist organisational structures, especially those that have endured, and the critiques of the mainstream that have been embedded there, be helpful as the mainstream resets at this particular point in history? How could our vision of this sort of intersectional feminist approach to reshaping the structures of museums, what does it look like? Certainly for me, it's a shift from feminism light that might be advocated in depoliticised EDI training in the industry, a shift there to an authentic accounting for abuses of power, a shift from, as it were, a rhetoric of tolerance to truth-telling and like rigorous resetting. Feminism has been concerned to recover women's lives and achievements from this sort of treadmill of history, a form of sort of perpetual amnesia that's been happening. So it feels to me critical that we situate current discussions of change linked to this history, this continuum of feminist knowledge. So in the next slide, we wanted to sort of share some definitions, because Sharon had been sort of saying to me, and it's something that I've heard from others as well, you know, we need to be sharing some definitions, and it is a sort of paradoxical thing because we don't want to prescribe and nail what feminism is, because it's lots of different things to different people. But feminist leadership, it feels like it needs to be researched, it needs to be thought through, it needs to be debated. So some people think, as I did for most of my adulthood, that feminist leadership was almost like a contradiction in terms, you know, that feminism contested all forms of leadership. And there was a bit of an impasse in my thinking, really, presented by or represented by polarisation of this sort of collective leadership ideal on the one hand and the command and control mode still dominating in the museum mainstream on the other. And that there didn't seem to be much nuanced research on feminist leadership in its more plural representations, and even less on its influence on the progressive reforming of leadership in the mainstream. So 1972, Jo Freeman, in an incredibly influential essay, The Tyranny of Structurelessness, discussed the inevitability of structures, hierarchies and leadership emerging in collective organising. But through Rachel Thangray's helpful suggestion, I came across another remarkable feminist leader, Patricia Yancey Martin, who is a rare researcher who sort of persuasively argued that feminist organisation and leadership have been significantly heterogeneous. She rejects the idea that early forms of feminist organising, just because they were collectivist in their formation, that effective feminist organising and leadership can't be at work in the mainstream, for example, within museum hierarchies, or that anything other than pure collective working is somehow a co-opted feminism or a redundant feminism. Anyway, I won't go on about that just now, but basically she's saying that heterogeneity has always been and continues to characterise the complexity of the movement. And you'll find out, I'll cite her, and you can find out about her in my Moving Mountains research bibliography. But I suppose I wanted to pull that into the conversation today, along with some other definitions. So the next slide, Sharon, I think, is from Janetta Batch-Cole, who is going to be speaking today, which I can't believe, it's just a marvelous thing that that we're going to be hearing from one of our remarkable elders today. But I suppose here we're seeing that Batch is talking about how this expanded notion about leadership that links from the micro to the macro should be one of the demands that we're making of ourselves, where we are looking at new visions, but we're looking at the past to look at the future. I think we move on, Sharon, if that's okay, because I'm mindful of the time, and I'll just wait a second before we set this one going. This further contribution going from one of our wonderful feminist leader colleagues. I was just sort of thinking a little bit about how the political imperatives of feminism start to align with the wider demands of equality, inclusion, representation. In fact, let's just hear from our lovely colleague Sarah first, and then we'll go on to discuss that further.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Smith and I'm recording this from my home in the middle of Denmark. I am developing my feminist leadership as the head of the Danish Welfare Museum, a social justice and activist museum at its very core. The museum itself is a socio-political cultural institution which is continuously being co-produced and co-developed in collaboration with people with lived experiences from marginalization and from stigmatizing institutional life. My definition of feminist leadership is leading the organization in an empowering, in a kind, in a passionate and courageous, and in a power-sharing and empathetic environment, challenging the injustices and normative power structures wherever I and we at the museum identify them, speaking out loud about equality, about understanding, and about worthiness for all. In this way, supporting the process of creating a both important and a useful museum of its time for both personal and societal change. And in this very, very critical moment in Danish and in global history, one of the demands to myself in my feminist leadership is to contribute with my own passion and my non-pollutive leadership fuel for positive change, creating this in fellowship with people experiencing injustices and fighting with them for social change. Thank you so very much for this opportunity to speak, and take care out there.
So that was Sarah Smad. I noticed in the subtitle, I think this was an earlier iteration of the presentation. So I'm so sorry to Sarah that there was a misspelling on her name there. But yes, I suppose that for some of us, we might claim that this type of leadership that Sarah's speaking about there, it's feminist leadership, but it's good leadership, and there's synonyms now, so it's no longer relevant to link good leadership explicitly to feminism. But I'm really keen to resist this pull to uncouple or elide feminism from our wider aims, from this sort of like relatively depoliticized call for equality, inclusion, and diversity. I'm really pleased that Sarah's sort of keen to claim this title and claim this name and explain almost the nuances of what's feminist about her approach. Should we go on to the next slide, Sharon? So the research and the publications on feminist leadership are remarkably sparse. Most have been interested and generated in the global development context in the global south, often authored by women of colour. A key text for me is Batuala's work from over a decade ago now, but that still is a compelling survey, a championing of feminist leadership. And I think it's indicative of the deep authenticity that she thinks is required of feminist leaders. And it chimes for me with a call for museum relevance on all registers, which I think is something that I'm hearing more and more as conference gathers each year. And amongst the demands that might be made of feminist leaders are these two asks here: challenging visible, hidden and invisible power, constructing alternative models of power that amplify and gradually eliminate invisible and hidden power, and what feminist leadership needs to strive to make possible, that's democratic and accountable at all levels. So this is an onerous ask. So if we go on to the next slide, I think this Batuala's sort of going on here to talk about this form of leadership being properly transformational, concerned with achieving gender justice, and I would argue making for social change. So what have you been saying about feminist leadership? I wondered, Rebecca, whether we might share the poll just now, just to sort of see what we're saying. Wow. So how interesting, because I've got a feeling, I don't know, Sharon, what you think, but I thought that maybe those checking into this session might have been people who were already well disposed to the idea of feminism. What's your reading of these poll findings, Sharon?
So I think there's something in here about labels and labelling and confidence. So that definitely came up through the chat as I was trying to monitor it rapidly. You know, people saying I felt too anxious to announce myself as a feminist in a professional capacity. I feel that it means people will see me as not being able to approach interpretation in an even-handed way, but also conversely, lots of people saying I'm going to go and edit my LinkedIn profile immediately and change my, you know, my social media profiles. And to be honest, Adele, when we first started discussing this session, I realised I didn't have feminist in my Twitter account, so I immediately rectified that. But there's something about the confidence of being able to own that space, but also understanding what feminist leadership is. When we first discussed it at Space Invaders, we literally had to, you know, look at all the different definitions and say, as you did, there's some element of individual choice there because there are many definitions. And you can look at it from your own personal lens as well as having a kind of global interpretation. So it doesn't surprise me, and I think it's about confidence, and I hope people will walk away from this session with a bit more confidence about owning the term feminist and thinking about feminist leadership.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I wonder on that point whether we're going to sort of like revisit the poll a little bit later, but I wondered at this point we could hear maybe from two other remarkable feminist leaders who are going to give their interpretation of what this means for them.
Yeah, I think Rebecca's going to share.
Sorry, I'm trying to share. It's just stuck. Start again, hang on.
Don't worry. Just while we're getting that video up, the two remarkable leaders that we're going to see in a second, Angela Wachuka and Wanjiro Koinanji, are two amazing women that I met in Nairobi last year, and we've been working with in the Women's Library. I think they're up on screen now.
Good morning from Nairobi, Kenya.
Hello, hello. My name is Wanjiru Koinange.
And I am Angela Oshuka.
And we are the co-founders of Bookworm Trust, which is an organization based here in Nairobi that is working to restore some of our most precious and iconic libraries.
And the question that we're facing this morning is practical examples of how we are providing feminist leadership or developing feminist leadership, I'd say, and learning at our organization. And a really practical way in which we've done this is a PMS day for anyone that gets periods and they get to work from home.
And for us, it's really important that we build systems for our organization, for our teams, that leave room for reflection, for inclusion, for inspiration, while serving the purpose of the system. So we think that that's one demand we're making of ourselves. That is a nod towards feminist leadership. Thank you.
That's it from Nairobi. All the best.
Bye.
I think it's really interesting to sort of see the way that Wachuka and Wanjiru are moving in and out of this sort of like operational and structural. You know, they're seeing the way that feminist leadership functions, you know, in those different registers. But also in their work, they're focused on a massive decolonisation project and social justice and regeneration, but rooted in this sort of idea of developing feminist leadership principles. Maybe we could move on to talk a little more. You've already mentioned, Sharon, about Space Invaders and the work you do in there. And I wonder, for those who would like to get involved, tell us more about what that project is trying to do in terms of feminist leadership.
Yeah, I will do. I mean, I would say, you know, in response to that question about can I label myself a leader, then I would say, you know, you don't have to be in a leadership position to enact change. And I think the idea that we could all campaign or enact in our workplace a PMS day, but also menopause training. I know that National Museum Wales, for example, has had menopause training for all senior staff so they understand what it is for their teams and any team members that might be undergoing menopause. So that would just be, you know, two small, brilliant examples of things that we can enact as feminists, which would, you know, be, you know, not necessarily have to be in a leadership position in order to make that change. So for us, Space Invaders came about, I think about 5 years ago. We sort of lose track of how long we've been around. We are basically just a campaign for equality and change for women in the museum and heritage sector. We met, as I say, about 5 years ago on a residential that was for women in the sector. And, you know, as you do at residentials, we sort of came together later on in the evening and were chatting. And we thought, you know, this is good. This is good to bring women together, but we're interested in making change, not just getting ourselves the next job. And that feminism has to be about more than that for us. And so from that, we organise a number of events. I mean, we all do it in our spare time. We all, most of us work in the sector. There's only a handful of us. And we developed the manifesto on the basis of workshopping with people who could turn up to our in real life events at the time. And out of that came the manifesto, which is around demanding equal power and influence with more women leading our institutions, fair conditions, because that's really critical, and it speaks to the last video, you know, a PMS day, but our day-to-day working life designed to meet our needs. And importantly, because we're from the museum and heritage sector, our stories told with real representation in collections, narratives, displays, and exhibitions that's telling our stories. And the other thing that we've kind of done is some research that you referred to, Adele. So we've looked at the moment, we're currently looking at the number of women who are on boards and who are chairs of boards, because trustees are very influential on our organisations, as we know. But also we've done, you know, our own peer networking and support of each other, and, you know, delighted to say that new groups and networks that are springing up, and that there's a Space Invaders in Scotland now and in the north of England. And I was sort of laughing to myself when I last looked at our Space Invaders website and saw that the description of our superpowers as Space Invaders included rousing speaking, sharp accessorizing, rigorous research, effortless organising, and power posing at heritage sites across the UK. So you have to check that out on our website. And I'm not as sure that we do the effortless organising that effortlessly, but we, you know, that's kind of in a nutshell who we are. And it is that thing about sort of understanding the change that we want to see, so theory of change stuff, but also understanding the methodologies that might support us to enact that. And sort of that's thinking about feminist leadership.
I think it's so critical that Space Invaders is there, because an hour is really not a lot of time to sort of like get the, you know, progress the discussion in the sector. And it feels like it is moves in and out of a lot of the discussions that are happening. But I think this idea of almost like what are the demands that we're making of ourselves as well as the sector is a really critical one. And I feel like sometimes having a forum where you can discuss what the blockers are in developing your feminist thinking in a specific work context is absolutely critical. And I suppose on that point, maybe if we look at the next slide, this is sort of important to for me to sort of say that I am making demands of myself just now, and I suppose the research culminated in me trying to sort of nail what were priorities for me. It's a little sample, and I know that Rebecca is going to sort of share a blog that I've written, or you can go directly to Women's Library website to sort of read the full demands, just to sort of get an idea of what it's sort of distilled for me just now, although these demands are changing basically in the process of learning and trying to understand better what I could do. And I suppose maybe one of the things that has cropped up in the chat room as well is like, I'm a middle manager or I'm a so-and-so, and that my feeling is that I'm seeing leadership all around me every day in the Women's Library, whether it's a volunteer who is teaching me how to manage digital stuff better, or it might be seeing how front of house are dealing with things, or seeing how colleagues are leading in other ways, you know, all the time. And I suppose I'm feeling like my role is increasingly, how can I encourage the people that I work with to understand better their leadership potential, you know, and appreciate the way that they can be perceived as leaders. So there's it's not to do with like the ladder, you know, it's not to do just with gaining a position of authority in a sort of command and control structure. But Sharon, do you want to share some of your the demands that you're making of yourself just now?
Yeah, sure, Adele. So, I mean, everything that you said, all of the above, obviously. And also, I try to sort of think about framing this through the lens of our manifesto, because that just gives it shape. And I would add the rider as well, that having this conversation and speaking to the feminists in the sector has made me think consciously about my values and my commitment to being a different type of leadership. But I don't always get it right. And I can use that to use this frame to challenge myself to be a different kind of leader and to be open to being supported by others in my network and beyond. So mine are based on our manifesto points, which would be around equal power, questioning the status quo where it exposes that inequality, and tackling inequality in the organisations that I work with. And I don't just mean the Museums Association, but I mean being a trustee of several organisations in the cultural sector, and also a volunteer as well, and in other walks of life, so not just in the museum and heritage sector. And then on fair conditions, it is about, for us, striving to be a progressive employer which is difficult in these times, but all the more important actually that we strive to be progressive and look after our staff and everybody who works in and with museums, the entire workforce, front of house, back of house, volunteers, everybody. And also calling out sexism in the workplace and the sector. It can still be difficult to do this, but as a leader, you have a voice, you have a position, you have a platform, and you should use it. And then the last one is about our stories told. So promoting women's stories through our channels. Obviously at the Museums Association, we do have good channels into the sector and good communication. So are we looking out for women's voices, women's stories, and promoting the work of women? And then I thought actually there is a bit about, you know, the demands that you make of yourself should also be giving yourself a break sometimes and exercising some self-care, because it is hard and we're in the middle of a global pandemic and life is difficult and there are many, many challenges for us working in this sector. So I think there's something about giving yourself a break, but also being an ally and supporting allies and good people and other feminists, which are the sort of demands that I've taken on.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And I wonder whether, I think we might have a slide of some of those, demands that you're making of yourself. And I wondered whether we could sort of encourage maybe people who are attending today to start to use the chat room to maybe share a demand that people are making of themselves in relation to sort of like this idea of feminist leadership. Or perhaps it might be that what do you need from a feminist leader or from feminist leadership within your workplace? And obviously that's a sort of biggie, you know, so maybe people need a little bit of time to sort of think about a demand that they might be making of themselves. But I would really encourage people to use the Space Invaders network to almost like keep focused on that and get support in your endeavour to bring about change, because making demands, the clues in the name, you know, that it is demanding and that it can be difficult. So we might let people, I'm just assuming that people are working on that and thinking about that. But I wonder whether we might, I'm mindful of the time, and I know we had some sort of like gremlins to begin with, but also that people do need space. Oh, I'm just noticing here. Ah, yeah, Lucy Harland, yeah. So that is a biggie. Lucy set up Space Invaders Scotland and is doing the Space Invaders podcast. And what she needs is more people to get active in organising and to be better at asking for help. So that's a massive demand that Lucy's made of herself. And I'm somebody who's benefiting from the work that she's doing there. So I really appreciate that. We'll let that chat sort of cook there. But I wondered in the meantime, maybe Rebecca, whether you could sort of stick up another poll. We've got another feminist leader who's going to sort of share her thoughts with us in a second. But before we do that, we've got a poll here. And we just wondered, Sharon and I are quite curious to sort of see after this session whether people feel more confident in citing feminist in their professional profile, or do you feel more confident to call yourself a feminist leader? Is that one of the demands that you're going to be making of yourself, as it is with me at the moment? I'm trying to get used to that initial discomfort. And are you committed to make a concrete demand of yourself as a feminist leader? So I wonder if people could spend a minute or so just filling in that poll. And I'm seeing here beautiful things coming in the chat room, like calling out sexism and championing intersectionality. Great that people are committing to this. So maybe we could, this is a very, very quick poll, but maybe we could close the poll and see what we've got. Wow. Oh, I can't tell you how that makes me feel. It's just so
That's
amazing.
great. I think
Thank you so
the
much,
genie's
Sharon.
out of the bottle, isn't it? I think, you know, we just have to have more of these conversations. That's the reality, Adele.
That is so, it's just made me feel, well, I think the watchword this morning was hopeful, and that's the feeling that I get when I see that. So I just wondered whether we might sneak in another inspiring feminist leader before we have a little breather. So could we, Rebecca, you've just been doing incredibly well in flicking in and out of this, but could we get the last of our wonderful global feminist leaders speaking?
Hello, my name is Jette Sandahl. I'm responding to your question about feminist leadership from my background as one of the founders of the Women's Museum of Denmark in the 1980s. Here are some underlying principles I took with me from there to my subsequent leadership positions in mainstream museums. 1. Work close to substance and focus on the mission, the values, and the ethical principles of your institution. 2. Trust management and staff with high level of information, also such as would elsewhere be considered privileged, thus generating transparency throughout the organization. 3. Shift the balance towards appreciation of collective results and less showcasing of individual status. 4. Respect is earned. 5. Care, empathy, and solidarity are essential for institutional and individual well-being. 6. Recognize the potential of the more invisible members of staff for whatever political and/or personal reasons they have previously been disempowered, mute, or muted. And 7. It is actually possible to create jobs and formal job announcements that favor underrepresented groups. 8. It is possible to write formal statutes or bylaws for leadership and governance that reflect and support the different set of values. And 9. It is possible to be granted formal exemption from official legislation and practices to develop alternative models which emphasize community relationships in governance, which support dialogue, consensus, and collective sharing of power in leadership, and which call for equality and care in the internal institutional relationships.
That's so powerful, and reminds us that there are also sort of feminist elders in the discussion. I think one of the things about holding intergenerational knowledge on feminism is a really important aspect as we move forward. I've noticed some absolutely amazing things happening in the chat room, and just wanted to congratulate Anjan Katwa for putting Intersectional Feminist on her Twitter handle, and also doing a beautiful description of what intersectional feminism is. I just wanted to sort of say that I would really love this conversation to continue. Space Invaders is there to have that conversation, especially while we've got the digital, we've got Zoom rooms to have these conversations in. If you don't have a chapter near you, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't still be involved in that conversation. Let's keep the conversation happening through Twitter with Museums 2020, and Sharon and I are here as well to sort of, the particular questions that you had there that you want to ask us about, then I'm sure both of us would be really happy to carry that on. And thank you awful much for bearing with me and my technical sort of ineptitude in the early session. Thanks to Rebecca and Sharon. I think it's absolutely a historic moment when thinking about working with the Museums Association director and thinking, oh yeah, should be up for the power of superpower of feminist leadership. I think that's a really, really important message just now for us all, that that you're there doing the feminist leadership that you're doing. But thanks to everyone who's participated. It's been really, really thought-provoking for me, and let's keep the conversation flowing. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Rebecca. And thanks to everybody who's attended.
Yes, and thanks for your patience as well as we got to grips with the technology. On that note, the next session is on the museum digital divide. That starts at 4 o'clock. So I'm definitely going to be going, and hopefully will explain why PowerPoint is not working for me today. Anyhow, I'll end the session there. Thanks so much, Adele and Sharon. See you everyone soon.
Thank you.